Hello and welcome to Policy Watch. Before we start discussing our top story, let's get you up to date with the week's headlines. GOM clears land acquisition bill. Final draft proposes consent of two-thirds of land users for acquiring land. The OECD predicts weak growth in coming quarters for most major economies. Joseph Stiglitz plumps for growth before inflation targeting. Pakistan and India make joint efforts to increase cooperation on the energy front. Policy Watch gets former Oil Secretary R.S. Pandey to speak on the issue. And telcos to shell out one-time spectrum fee. EGOM defers decision on the crucial issue of pre-farming spectrum. Those are the headlines, and my guest this week is Priyaranjan, Managing Editor of the Financial Chronicle. Welcome to Policy Watch one more time, sir. Let's get straight into our first story. Now, a group of ministers headed by Agriculture Minister Sharad Pawar has cleared the long-delayed Land Acquisition Amendment Bill. The bill can now be introduced in the forthcoming winter session of Parliament. The final draft of the bill proposes consent of two-thirds of land losers for acquiring land for public-private partnership and private projects. The draft bill says acquisition in scheduled areas should be avoided, but if necessary, it should follow the consent of local systems of governance like the Gram Sabhas. The land acquisition bill has been in the pipeline since UPA won, but fell victim to coalition differences. Differences within the party itself also delayed the GOM nod. A number of ministers in the government have gone on record saying that the stringent provisions for acquiring land have the potential to discourage industrialization and urbanization. Now, Priyaranjan, is this sort of a victory for Green Warrior Jairam Ramesh, or as you were just telling me before the show, it could run into some more hurdles?
Well, we are yet to see a final version of what the government comes up with the Land Acquisition Bill. Now, as you know, the Land Acquisition Act is an anarchic act
1894.
of 1894.
Right.
And clearly that kind of a colonial era act has little relevance. At this point, one of the biggest developmental challenges that India is facing concerns land, water and forests, jal, jameen and jungle.
Right.
So that being the case, one need not be, given that it's a very difficult issue, and a balance needs to be struck between the interest of various interests and the pressure that is there on the land. After all, land is in very limited supply. Agriculture needs land. We have a huge population to feed. So our food demand is going up. Food inflation is double digit in recent years. So agriculture needs land. Industry needs land. Land is required to bridge the huge infrastructure deficit that we have. So land has, land acquisition has become a very contentious, controversial issue, and naturally it has taken so long because a balance has to be struck between the various interests. But above all, the interest today, one has to see that it is the farmer's interest, the landowner, and those who've been making a livelihood depending on the land, and without the land they do not have a livelihood.
Right.
So naturally they have the first stake on the land. Having said that, one must also look at the requirement for government acquiring land for public purpose or for common good.
Right.
Now that's a very tricky issue.
Now, you mentioned that even though the GOM has cleared this bill now, it will go to UPA chairperson Sonia Gandhi has expressed reservations about the current form of the bill. Now, if she vetoes it, it goes into the dumpster right away. But even before that happens, or if that happens at all, industry is not really happy with this current final draft, especially electricity companies. It's going to be a costly affair to mine coal now, other minerals as well. If the cabinet does approve the land acquisition bill, will industry take? Are they happy with 66% in the current draft at all?
Well, 66% would be, two-thirds approval of landowners for the government acquiring land for giving it to private industry would be reasonable from the industry's point of view. And in fact, following the GOM decision to that effect, the reported decision of GOM, industry has been fairly relaxed about that kind of a provision. However, as we know, the bill has gone through the Standing Committee of Parliament, and the Standing Committee of Parliament, for instance, wanted this to be 80% of the landowners, not only the landowners, but also people who whose livelihood depend on that land, approving it. And plus the approval that is required to be taken from the community in the form of the approval of Gram Sabhas. Now, these politically, in the present situation, it's actually, when every day you have a scam which centers around land, and this feeling throughout the country that the powerful
are grabbing land.
Anybody, be it the civil society bigwigs, the politicians cutting across party lines, that is the atmosphere. Given that atmosphere, and given the fact that recent years we have seen farmers and massive, people's agitation.
Movements, activists.
People's, we've just had a agitation which was terminated at Agra following a 10-point agreement that the people leading that movement reached with the central government.
Right.
So, given this kind of a political situation, one should not actually look at only what suits the industry.
You have to look at the greater good and the good of the people. But the bill will no longer, according to this draft, have a retrospective effect. Instead, there is a cut-off date for its implementation. I think that should ease some worry within industry, shouldn't it?
Yes, that's what one understands, that GOM has, where land has already been acquired, it doesn't want to impose the new conditions on that.
That means the projects that are already started won't come under this particular draft.
That I think is a reasonable thing to do, because projects, but there have been financial closures. Projects have been banked on a certain assumptions. Now those projects will be running into serious questions of viability if the new norms are imposed on the land.
So no retrospective retrospective effect is a good thing for at least industry.
Yes.
Right. One more question.
That's a fair, reasonable
That's a
thing,
fair, reasonable kind of provision that they've kept there. One more point I would like to discuss on this particular story, Mr. Dash. Over and above the 66% consent required from landowners in case of acquisition in scheduled areas, mainly which are tribal areas in maybe Chhattisgarh or with heavy tribal population, an approval would be required by local bodies like the Gram Sabhas, etc. Now, would you say, plus also that the fact that the UPA chairperson as well as Jairam Ramesh want no dilution of protective measures for tribals and people with land, does that make it a fair bill that has addressed all the concerns of land activists and tribals who've been opposing it tooth and nail till now?
I think it is imperative that the local community backs up the project. Because we've had projects worth 2.5 lakh crore hanging fire today because of land acquisition related issues and opposition on the ground. Now, it is clearly not in the interest of industry or in the interest of infrastructure development or any commercial activity for that matter, that it runs into local opposition, from the local community. And that needs to be avoided. In any case, those projects would not be making much of a progress. We've had several examples, of recent projects which have fallen through because of that. So it is a reasonable thing that land acquisition made, particularly when it is given to private companies, right, for development or for putting up projects, should require the community approval. Insofar as tribals are concerned, I think the Tribals or the Forest Dwellers Rights Act is a very good initiative, and that should not be diluted. And that must, particularly with regard to the tribals' rights and with regard to the compensation that is envisaged, land for land, in the case of tribals, for instance,
Right.
those provisions must be maintained, because otherwise, actually, development would have no meaning. Because if it doesn't benefit people at the grassroots, then we
Then what
will
is the
have
point
the
of
same kind
reforms?
of problems that we've been having
Right.
in vast tract of the country, where you have nationalism and extremism.
Right. On that point, we'll take a small break. Of course, we'll have to see whether or not the UPA chairperson does, in fact, veto this, the clearing of this bill and introduction in Parliament as well. We'll take a short break right now. We'll come back more with Priyaranjan Dash on the other side of this break. Welcome back to Policy Watch. Now, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in its latest global overview had said this month that leading indicators for the 34-nation body point to weakening growth in the coming quarters for most major economies. The OECD also gave its opinion on India's growth. The country's economic growth was mainly attributed to increasing purchasing power of the people and is less dependent on external factors. There is a note of caution, however, as the OECD General Secretary has said that India cannot be insulated from external factors. As part of the ongoing OECD conference, Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph E. Stiglitz is also in India, and an important statement has said that in a trade-off between growth and moderate inflation, a developing nation should choose growth. Stating that inflation fears in India are overdone and over-exaggerated, Stiglitz had said the Reserve Bank of India should look into cutting interest rates and push growth. Now, the OECD, after its conference in Delhi, just got over, in fact, Jairam Ramesh was the keynote speaker there as well, has come out with some suggestions for the government, mainly being that India should push its banking sector and give out new licenses to private players, more licenses to private players. Also has asked the government to concentrate on rural banking. Now, the RBI has already been given instructions by the Finance Ministry to give out the final guidelines on this matter. Do you see the government moving on that front anytime soon, on the specific question of private players getting banking licenses?
I believe that the Reserve Bank of India has already come out with draft guidelines about the licensing of new private banks. Now, this question of finalizing the draft, and there's been indications from both from the government and even from the finance minister that the Reserve Bank can be expected to soon, meaning maybe a couple of months, within a couple of months, come out with the final guidelines. Now, the problem was that whatever was holding back the Reserve Bank from coming out with the final guidelines, in the namely the amendment to the banking law, it seems that now the government at least has taken a view that the Reserve Bank can go ahead and license new private banks even without the banking law amendment going through. So that being the case, one expects the guidelines to be finalized soon, and thereafter actually the new banks to be licensed.
Right, right. Also, interestingly, Joseph E. Stiglitz, as part of the OECD conference, had said something, and you and I were talking the other day, and you made a very interesting comment saying that the learned professor had perhaps given the right prescription for the wrong country. Please tell the viewers of Policy Watch this time around why you said that.
Well, see, the thing is that in India, now when Professor Stiglitz says that 8% inflation in a developing country is normal,
Okay. Acceptable.
normal, that's, we know in India that it is not acceptable. That is, we've had 8% growth, 8% inflation for many years, but it is clearly not acceptable for the simple fact that in a good year, if we make progress by way of pushing up some people above the poverty line, which is a ridiculous poverty line. In fact, it's a starvation line. But even so, even when some people go up that line, that means they manage to get 2 meals a day. If you have 8% inflation, then several of them, millions of them actually fall below that. That means they don't even get adequate food to eat, particularly when food inflation runs at double digit, sometimes 15% or even 20%.
Right.
Now, that being the case, clearly Professor Stiglitz is not, not giving the right prescription for a country like India.
Right. He also did make an interesting comment, which I thought had some merit. He said that in case of a stimulus, government giving out a stimulus, the government should invest in itself, like in areas like technology, in areas like education, instead of just giving consumers tax breaks or tax holidays. How important is that?
That's a fair point. Means that is to the extent that the government has the capacity to invest in productive assets or make investments which can yield, like investment in social infrastructure or in physical infrastructure. To the extent that the government has the resources to do so, it's a good thing to do that. But as we know, the government is living beyond its means, meaning its consumption expenditures are more than the revenue that it collects. So most of the time, it's borrowing heavily. And at the moment, the government has a problem of large borrowing. So it has to also watch the situation like in Greece or in Europe. We've had huge overhang of debt, sovereign debt. We have to also see that the government doesn't get into that kind of a debt trap. So its capacity to make good investments in say physical infrastructure or in social infrastructure is heavily constrained by the fact that it lands up spending a lot of money and wasting a lot of money in things like subsidies which do not reach the beneficiaries,
Right.
and in wages and in all kinds of wasteful
Interesting, you
expenditure.
mentioned subsidies. The government, today was the big launch of the Athar. It coincides with the 2-year anniversary of Athar as well. The government is going big with this, claiming that this will reduce the burden and it will make sure that subsidies go to the people who actually deserve it.
That is a very positive development. And as the progress today shows that in 2 years, they've been able to cover 21 crore people. And by 2015, they are confident of being able to reach 60 crore people. Now, if the coverage of Aadhaar is broad-based like that, it will be possible to actually provide a lot of government services to the targeted beneficiary without leakages and without wastage.
But what do you say to the detractors of, I was talking to one gentleman yesterday and he said that I'm against Aadhaar till it actually does what it's supposed to do, and there are leakages in Aadhaar itself as well. There is no guarantee of no corruption in Aadhaar. What do you say to people who have said that this is, the biometric system in Aadhaar is actually impinges on the rights of the local populace? Also, the fact that Aadhaar has, a majority of people are not under Aadhaar right now. And what do you say to those people? There is a different view there as well.
See, it can't be anybody's case that Aadhaar is the panacea, that it will solve every problem that you have in the delivery of government services, be the subsidies or services. So the government, but it's a huge improvement in governance.
Right. And that is the point to see. It's a huge improvement on something that has been.
I don't say, or anybody, I don't think it can be anybody's claim that Aadhaar is going to solve all problems related to governance.
Right. That would be a very nice statement to make. We'll take another short break right now. Mr. Dash will come back after the break. More on Policy Watch after this short breather. keeping aside cross-border tensions, India and Pakistan are making joint efforts to increase cooperation on the energy front. Pakistan, which has 60 oil and gas exploration blocks, wants to offer some of them to Indian companies on a bilateral basis. Pakistan's Petroleum Minister Asim Hussain has also expressed his desire to import diesel and petrol from India if the price is right. A team of Hindustan Petroleum HPCL team is expected to go to Pakistan to discuss the prices. Policy Watch Rahul Kapoor spoke to former Oil Secretary R.S. Pandey in the Petroleum Ministry to understand the feasibility of these plans.
Keeping aside cross-border tensions, India and Pakistan are making joint efforts to increase cooperation on the energy front. And to talk more on this, I have former Oil Secretary in the Petroleum Ministry, Mr. R.S. Pandey with me. Welcome to Policy Watch, sir. So India and Pakistan are making joint efforts to increase cooperation on the energy front. Mr. Asim Hussain, Petroleum Minister of Pakistan, has said that it wants to offer its oil and gas exploration blocks to India. So your thoughts on this?
Well, it certainly makes a strong economic sense and also political sense to promote such kind of activities. India would have surplus production of petroleum products with the Bina refinery of BPCL and Bhatinda refinery of Mittal HPCL venture. And this surplus could partly go to Pakistan. That will help our companies also. For Pakistan also, given the proximity in terms of distance, it makes sense. If Indian companies get oil exploration blocks in Pakistan, that will help both. The regional cooperation between two neighbors, which may not have the best of relations as on today, but both aspire to have the best of relations. And certainly this economic interdependence would help that process as well.
The minister also said that Pakistan wants to import diesel and petrol from India if they get the right price, and a team of Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited will go to Pakistan to determine the right price. How feasible is this?
Well, the right price has to be international price. India also imports to some extent. India also exports, and these are all done at international prices. So that should hopefully prevail as far as pricing is concerned. They can do it through sea routes. Also pipeline can be laid further, but sea route is easier. And as far as Bhatinda is concerned, some pipeline will have to be laid. But these are all feasible.
A major concern remains that unless and until you get the cross-border tensions right, the room for bilateral economic ties is very less. So how do you see both India and Pakistan coming through that?
Well, export-import is already going on, despite some tensions. And more economic interdependence will help reduce tensions in the long run. So I think this has to go on simultaneously.
How do you see sharing of refineries and pipelines and data help the crude oil sector in both India and Pakistan, and how will it make them competitive in the global market?
Well, this will all help. As I said, it makes a strong economic sense if both countries cooperate with each other because they are neighbors, they're close by. It is an international saving, and it will help both the countries.
Thank you so much, sir, for talking to Policy Watch. We heard the former Oil Secretary in the Petroleum Ministry, Mr. R.S. Pandey, and he said that it's a welcome step and it will help both India and Pakistan if they develop more cooperation and they increase the economic ties on the energy front. That's all I have for now. Back to you in the studio.
Another step towards bilateral ties, of course. Thank you, Priyaranjan Dash, for joining us on Policy Watch this week. Our first story this week on Policy Watch was the group of ministers clearing the land acquisition bill. Of course, roadblocks still remain for this bill. Like we said before, UPA chairperson Sonia Gandhi has expressed her reservations on the 66%. She's plumping for more, about 80%. We'll have to wait and watch whether this actually goes to cabinet, and then, of course, it'll go to the winter session of parliament. But like Mr. Dash said, the idea behind this particular bill should be that the people at the grassroots should actually benefit from it. Our second story on Policy Watch this week was the OECD conference on global economy that happened in New Delhi. Of course, Joseph E. Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, did make some comments in plumping growth before inflation targeting. That, of course, to which my guest had replied that he perhaps, the learned professor perhaps, made the right prescription for the wrong country. And as you heard, R.S. Pandey, the former oil secretary, in our third story, this is a step in the right direction. And India and Pakistan need to increase mutual cooperation and bilateral trade to, in fact, benefit from that as well. That's all the time we have on Policy Watch this week. Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching.